Okay. Tuia I runga, tuia I raro, tuia I roto, tuia I waho. Tuia te here tangata, tūturu whakamaua kia tina.
Tina.
Haumie, huie, tai kie. Right, kia ora e te whānau. Welcome to our October Kai Kōrero, a fair chance for all, breaking the cycle of persistent disadvantage. And very honoured to have here today Catherine Prophet from the New Zealand Productivity Commission, who will talk about the report and some of its findings. I'm just going to share a little bit because SSPA has been involved with this inquiry sort of right from the outset of all the public consultation parts. We very much welcome the report. We see it as a really strong one that makes a insightful and presents an insightful and up-to-date range of findings, and that really do reflect the reality of what you, our members, and the whānau you work with see and experience, and which we at SSPA see happening at that systems level. We welcomed the report because it made really practical, actionable recommendations that could take us down a really powerful collective pathway towards our country being a place where there truly is a fair chance for all. Huh, right, before and as I said, we've contributed to this from its outset. It also was my first experience of being involved in an inquiry right from its really early inception. We brought members together to discuss the terms of reference back in 2021, and I see some familiar faces who had been part of that process. In fact, all of these processes right the way through, giving us advice and sharing their feedback and thoughts. We also built a relationship with the inquiry team as it progressed, and I really valued that. It was really interesting to meet regularly with Bronwyn, who was on the inquiry, and she shared what was going on at their end, and I could share what was happening in our world and what we were seeing. And I found that it was just such a really powerful thing to be a part of. We also had the inquiry team come to our online whakamanawa conference in 2022 to share some of the early findings they had and for you all to feed into that process. And then once the interim report was released later in October 2022, we brought you all together again to feed into that and how we could share recommendations from our community-based social service sector into that, what the final report could be. So it's just felt such a connected process, and it's really great to again have Catherine here who can share some more about it. So I welcome you, Catherine. And Catherine is one of the 2 inquiry directors at the New Zealand Productivity Commission. She has a background in policy and strategy with over 14 years experience working in and consulting to the public sector. So Catherine, I'd like to hand it over to you so you can talk directly with everyone here.
Kia ora, Fiona. Thank you so much for the welcome and for the opportunity to speak on this kaupapa. Yes, really want to acknowledge how SSPA has been alongside the Commission for this work. Incredibly valuable submissions, both of the submissions that came through, and I know you had a leading role in developing those, Fiona, on behalf of the members, so thank you very much. And a special shout out, of course, to Claire Ahmed, who participated in quite a few of our events and our webinar, and so really kind of helped us get the message out and talking into places where the Productivity Commission doesn't necessarily have a natural kind of channel into. So yeah, I really want to say thank you for all of that. It's all contributed to the strength of the collective mahi, so thank you. So yes, kia ora koutou, ko Catherine Prophet tōku ingoa. As Fiona said, I'm one of the inquiry directors at Te Komehana Whaihua o Aotearoa, or the New Zealand Productivity Commission. What is that slide? There we go. And so that name translates to mean the commission that pursues abundance for Aotearoa, which is, I think, a really nice reflection and expansion of the notion of productivity. It's something that is for the purpose of the well-being of all of New Zealanders. So just for anyone who doesn't know, the Productivity Commission is an independent Crown agency. One of our core functions is to do these inquiries, which are quite substantial pieces of research and policy work. They can be a year, or in this case, the Fair Chance for All inquiry was, I think, 2.5 years in total, taking into account the consultation on the terms of reference, which isn't a process that has happened before with an inquiry. Usually the terms of reference are provided to us. So it was really such a privilege to be working on this kaupapa. I picked it up about a third of the way through, so I wasn't there for the early stages, but helped deliver the interim and the final report. And I want to just acknowledge that I'm obviously speaking on behalf of my team, the many members of my team, and the Commission more broadly. You know, the submitters, this mahi is a collective effort, and also just to acknowledge the lived experience of people who are living complicated lives in complexity, and for whom this work is for, really. So on that note, just to say that the Commission, as I said, the inquiry topics are set by ministers. Then we are independent once we get the topic, and we work away, and then we deliver the report back to ministers. We don't have any powers of implementation, so it's over to the government to decide what to do with some of the more formal recommendations. But of course, that doesn't preclude any other organisation building on, advocating for this work, seeing what resonates, seeing what you can take from it, because it's not just all about government decision makers. We are all leaders in our own spaces. So this is just what I'm going to cover. I'm going to talk about the inquiry kaupapa, what we found, and the pathway forward. So some of the recommendations. We made 20 recommendations, so I'm not going to be able to speak in detail to all of them. I'll just sort of give a bit of a summary. Excuse me, but I'm happy if anyone has any questions, we can chat at the end. So just in terms of what we were asked to look at, an inquiry into economic inclusion and social mobility, focusing on the drivers and underlying dynamics of persistent disadvantage. So that's disadvantage that persists through the life course, or intergenerational disadvantage. And this is really kind of acknowledging that there's been report after report on on a lot of these topics. But thinking about the dynamics of how disadvantage compounds and persists was the kind of particular thing that we were asked to think about. It had 6 referring ministers, which I think speaks to the breadth of and the complexity of the topic. So we reported back to the Ministers of Finance, Māori Development, Pacific Peoples, Social Development, Revenue, one more that escapes me, but a broad half a cabinet, really, we reported back to, but some things were out of scope for us. So because the tax working group had already done an exhaustive look at the tax system, we didn't look at that again. And also we were asked to not duplicate the work of the welfare expert advisory group. So we didn't examine in detail the welfare system, although many of the system issues that we're talking about, of course, touch on both of those subsystems. Constitutional reform was out of scope for us. And so within that, we had to make some, because this is an enormous topic, as you'll appreciate, and even with 2.5 years to look at it, with a team of 5 people, we had to make some decisions about where we were going to focus. And we chose to focus on, and advised to from submissions like from organisations like yourselves, where should we focus that goes up the system and stops getting into managing symptoms of persistent disadvantage and looks at the features of the whole system and what is holding persistent disadvantage in place. So with that in mind, we focused on the public management system, and I can talk a bit about that in a moment. We commissioned we had a very wide evidence base for this inquiry. So apart from all of the substantial engagement that we did, so we heard from 1,000 people during the terms of reference, we received 155 written submissions, we had hundreds of hui around the motu, policy workshops with our public sector colleagues, wānanga and talanoa with Māori and Pacifica communities, and then we commissioned some particular pieces of research that fed into this. So we had some specific research done on public accountability and how that may or may not be contributing as a system feature to persistent disadvantage. We also worked with the Growing Up in New Zealand study group, and they did some particular analysis of their study results to look at the resources of families with children and how that can result in different outcomes as children grow up. So we were also asked to build on He Ara Waiora, which is a tikanga framework that under the auspices of Ngā Pūkenga, which has now been adopted by Treasury to sit along the Living Standards Framework as a tikanga Māori view of wellbeing. So we situated the aspects of that within the way that we wanted to think about this. It was tricky for us because the terms of reference directed us both to consider persistent disadvantage and also to be strengths-based. And those, you can see persistent disadvantage is not exactly a strengths-based framing. So we wanted to think about the mana of people here, and we've kind of centered that in there with Mauri ora. And we were thinking about the features of the system. So the resources and living environment that people have to draw on, the life events and circumstances that can impact on the wellbeing of people and communities, and then systems such as the public management system. And that all sits within, of course, the socioeconomic and political environment. So, you know, this was just the kind of broad model that we were situating our thinking within. And you will already know this, but we wanted to make sure that no one was under any illusions that we were talking about a dynamic experience of disadvantage. It's not just about being income poor. So we kind of framed it with these three dimensions of income poverty being one, but doing without. So this is broader material aspects of life, but also being left out and excluded, whether that be through discrimination or whether that be through limited access to services, or whether that be through limited ability because of dispossession and colonisation and those sorts of things to connect with your community and your identity. So it's quite a broad concept of disadvantage. Conceptually, it's quite broad. When we tried to measure it, we had to kind of, it was much more difficult to measure it because we were wanting to move through time as well. We had to work with data sets, limited data sets. So there were only a few indicators that we could use. So that was a shame, but we did what we could with that. So one of the things we were asked to do was to quantify persistent disadvantage and also understand the patterns and dynamics for that. So in order to do that, we did some of our own quantitative analysis. This was new work. This was constructed through the linking together the 2013, the 2018 censuses, and some of the Household Economic Survey and the Household Social Survey through time. So this is following the same people through time, because most studies are only looking at point in time. It's not the same people, but then you can't see whether someone's experience of disadvantage persists through their life. So the best way to do that properly would be longitudinal studies. We don't do very many of those in New Zealand. There's a Dunedin study and Growing Up in New Zealand, and that's pretty much it. So we had to construct this sort of pseudo longitudinal study using the data we had available. So it's a bit experimental, but what this speaks to is the number of people or the proportion of people who experience disadvantage. Overall, we found that nearly a fifth of New Zealanders experienced persistent disadvantage in one or more of these areas in both 2013 and 2018. So that was quite an astonishing result. When we found that, we had to go back and double check that we got our numbers right because it seemed so high. But that is the fact of the matter. So, and this shows how how those proportions kind of fall. So, for instance, 3.6% of New Zealanders are only persistently income poor, and then they could be in more than one domain, and so that's the number that's in the overlap, and then there's 0.4% of the population who experiences persistent disadvantage in all three of those areas. There's a whole report just on the quantitative analysis that we did, and I'm happy to send that. I can send that to Fiona to send out to people who are interested. It talks about the method. It also talks about all of the kind of analysis where we looked at the patterns of people entering into and then coming out of disadvantage. So there's some quite interesting things in that report for people who are interested in that. So as I said before, there's been so many reports and recommendations on how to address disadvantage, but we know that it continues to persist at significant levels. I've just talked about the levels that it persists at. And so we were thinking about how could we best focus our report. Should we do a deep dive into housing? Should we do a deep dive into or a retake of the social sector inquiry that we'd previously done in 2015? Should we look at mental health? But all of those are sectors that have common features across them. And so we really wanted to lift our sights and look at some of the features that cut across those sectors rather than doing deep dives. And if you take a systems view, then you're really thinking about, because there's stuff that you can see in a system, and many of you will have seen the kind of iceberg model that I'm talking about here. It's sort of in a triangle here. This is the waters of systems change for people who might be familiar with that model. But there's things in a system you can see. So where money flows, specific policies, those are things you can see in a system. But the power dynamics, the relationships, and the mental models and assumptions that sit behind that are often things that you can't see. And those are the things that really kind of need to change if you want to get true system change. But it's hard to change things that you can't see, right? And it's hard to change things that you don't name. So quite a lot of the work that we were doing, and this is quite a different approach for the Productivity Commission, so acknowledging the challenges in all of these spaces, was drawing attention to some of the mental models and assumptions that sit behind how the public management system operates. And when I say public management system, I'm talking about the public sector agencies, how they relate to one another, the interface with the political system, how agencies are held to account and how they demonstrate that accountability, how policy gets made, and how resources get allocated. So that's the kind of broad definition of public management system that we were thinking about. So just to set that scene, and you can see how we related this to the kind of socioeconomic model. On the left-hand side, the context systems that nest going from the micro level to the macro level. So this is quite a complex slide to talk to, but hopefully I've given you a bit of a flavour of the systems approach that we wanted to take there. And the reason that we wanted to talk about public management in particular, it's not really a system that's had a lot of interrogation, I think, in and of itself. But the root causes of inequities in people's lives are mainly outside the public management system, but the system has a huge effect on people's ability to thrive. So it has this huge influence. And things like the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care, the report of the Welfare Expert Advisory Group, they've highlighted areas where the state has failed and exacerbated harm. And so those are some, the Royal Commission into Abuse and Care is a fairly extreme example. But there are features of the system that hold people back from thriving. So we wanted to call those out. I mean, as I say, who gets to be part of policy decisions? What evidence are we using? What frames of reference? What assumptions? Whose assumptions? All of these things are important. So that's what we were thinking about. So just to to get to our overall findings, and some of these won't be surprising to you, people working in the sector, but in terms of us wanting to name these things and calling them out, we thought it was quite important. So of course the drivers of disadvantage is systemic, which means looking for silver bullet solutions and saying, is it mental health, is it housing, is the wrong way of thinking about it. It's systemic. Power imbalances create advantage for some and compound disadvantage for others. Discrimination and ongoing impacts of colonisation compound disadvantage, so that's been very clear. We had a particular report done into this aspect, and I think, it can be very easy for people to think of as colonisation as something that happened a long time ago, and it doesn't. It's not happening. It's not continuing to happen. But of course, colonisation is a long-term process. And colonisation shaped many of the institutions of the public management system. They have their origins in British systems, British antecedents. They're not of New Zealand. And therefore they are grounded in a lot of those assumptions that go way back hundreds of years. And many of our laws continue to create and compound disadvantage in a range of ways. We found that being in disadvantage is associated with distrust, the distrust of those institutions, distrust of the public sector, distrust of politicians. None of this is surprising, but our quantitative analysis was able to highlight that feature. What we couldn't do was understand the direction of that relationship, so we weren't able to tell whether being in disadvantage made people more distrustful, or having distrust made what direction that relationship went. But there's a relationship there nonetheless. And then we also found that the settings that underpin New Zealand's public management system, while they are evolving, they are part of the problem. So calling that out. That's just a point around disadvantage being associated with distrust. So when I talk about what we found for longer, I go into a bit more detail about some of these factors, but I'll just leave this on the screen for you to read in terms of some of the challenges that we found with the public management system. So narrow focus on economic and material prosperity at the expense of other more holistic forms of well-being. Some values being emphasised more than others in policy-making decisions. And the particular example we picked up on there was individualistic values versus collective values. So, because that's a particular frame of reference, individualistic values being a feature of, Western or Pākehā ways of thinking, and that infiltrates policy making. It's also a lot of research is done on benefits to individuals as opposed to benefits to collectives. Systems struggling to recognise or account for a full range of impacts on wellbeing when making decisions, and then overly focused on short-termism being something that kind of infiltrates the system. Part of that is the political imperative. Part of it is our human bias towards making short-term decisions. But there's not enough features in the system that support long-term decision making and long-term thinking. And then you will all be very familiar with this system failing to respond to people experiencing multiple challenges at the same time. So if individuals or whānau have got one thing that they need support with, the system can manage that. When you've got complex and compounding challenges, then it feels the need to put people into boxes and say, no, we can only address this part and this part and this part. So in terms of where we, pages sorted, in terms of where we focused our recommendations, we had three main areas: the purpose and direction of the public management system, accountability, and then learning and voice. So I'm just going to speak really briefly about what we found in each of these areas, and then I'll shoot to the recommendations. So in terms of purpose and direction, what we found was, and you'll all be aware about wellbeing budget and trying to, channel public spending into areas of wellbeing. So we found that some of that work is a really good start. I think we were world leading in New Zealand when we initiated that, but we've kind of left it stop at the budgeting level, and the budget is only a small proportion of the total investment across the public sector. And so unless you're looking at how the whole of public investment is actually contributing to wellbeing, you're only doing that in quite a marginal kind of way. And we focus quite a lot on measuring wellbeing and not really understanding the holistic set of approaches and policy interventions that get you there. And measuring doesn't get you there. You need measurement, but it's only one side of the story. And then I think a lot of those kind of underlying assumptions that I rattled through really quickly before kind of hamper the true implementation of a proper wellbeing approach, which should be holistic, intergenerational in nature, and have equity at the heart. So if we've got a system which is built around outcomes for individuals, if it's built around managing budgets, kind of gets in the way of more holistic long-term thinking. And so a clearer system purpose and direction is needed for wellbeing for the public management system, and that would encompass how it then works with partners like providers like yourselves. In terms of public accountability, this was a really fascinating area because this was based on a sense that factors of accountability, so what the public service is accountable for, really can help or hinder what it does, of course. And if you've got command and control kind of basis under your accountability, you've got an accountability mindset that's kind of about punishing people if they fail, then that doesn't foster continuous improvement, doesn't foster learning, and it doesn't foster the kind of holistic, interconnected relational ways of working that we know benefit people who experience persistent disadvantage. So nobody's really looked at that, I think, to any great degree, and it's been really fascinating as a public policy geek because the public finance system has been modernised, and we've had the new Public Services Act come in 2020, which is all about the spirit of service and collective working. But accountability wasn't really looked at as part of those reforms. And it seems to me the third leg of that stool. How can you look at how the resources flow and how we collectively work together without re-looking at what are our mental models of what accountability means, and thinking into collective accountability instead of individualistic siloed accountabilities for individual agencies. So we also found that the public management accountability system has got no real reference to utility, which seemed to us to be a very obvious gap. And also, you will all know this, but that the kind of high level mental model of accountability flows through into your kind of really tightly constricted contracting arrangements, burdensome monitoring, disproportionate scrutiny on kaupapa Māori providers. All of those things are symptoms, we think, of a lack of really reconsidering whether our accountability model is fit for purpose as a nation. So there's a lot in this area. We commissioned a whole report into this, but basically the features of our current accountability system are siloed decision making and vertical accountability. So minister, chief executive, agency, provider, down to the person. So it's a vertical. It's not a equal and relational, multi-directional accountability system. And as I say, that leads to narrow transactional contracting approaches. Of course, we've got the social sector commissioning program of work, which we think is heading in the right direction, but it will come up against this accountability model mindset, right? That was our sense of where that it would be constrained until you kind of get more fundamental about what does accountability mean in New Zealand. And so basically these gaps in our accountability system, they reflect an overemphasis on preventing abuse of power, and that's kind of, you know, the whole our whole parliamentary system, our checks and balances, all of that is kind of built around that. And preventing abuse of power is essential, don't get me wrong, but if that makes people focus on delivery instead of actual outcomes, then it's kind of a pseudo accountability trap, because you're having a kind of performance of accountability, but if the results are no different, then what are you actually achieving? We also did a lot of work thinking about what would you need if highly devolved and localized. So I should take a step back and say a strong message that we in this work is that disadvantage is an experience that people experience disadvantage in place, and so trust in the people around you and the devolution of and delivery of services at that local level in a joined up holistic way, that's the best evidence for the kinds of services that work, right? But if we've got a mismatch between our public accountability and our funding settings that don't really enable that, you know, you've had all of these place-based initiatives and pilots of different things, but there's kind of no overarching way of supporting this different kind of service delivery. And yeah, we're hopeful that the Social Sector Commissioning Action Plan will get some of the way, but we do feel like that there's some fundamental constraints in the mindset about what accountability looks like. And then also in terms of the learning and voice, so this is really thinking about how do you give voice to the people experiencing persistent disadvantage in much more nuanced and equitable ways. How does that truly affect decision making? How do you channel that back up into decisions that are being made at the national level or at the local level where that's appropriate? And how do we get more rapid adaptation, and so that we're not stuck doing stuff that we know doesn't really work? And one of the things, so this was thinking about how the public management system also needs to support providers at the local level in terms of being able to collect more suitable data, how to use that in your own kind of day-to-day, but then what is needed at a national level to make decisions. And we were really struck by, so in the public sector, there's the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet has got a system-wide responsibility for the quality of policy work, but there's no equivalent in the system for how we collect information, how we use evidence. Nobody is looking after that at a system level. So each agency is doing their own thing, as I'm sure you experience. And it just seemed, you know, like a very obvious gap. But I want to just stress here that this is not just about better and more consistent monitoring and evaluation, although that would certainly help. I think what we're talking about here is a change in mindset. So this is about reorienting towards investing and learning by doing. So that's quicker scale, not waiting for a 5-year study to show whether something works or not. And to really understand the lived realities of individuals, families, whānau, and communities experiencing persistent disadvantage and what matters to them, not what matters to the centre of the system, what matters to the people experiencing persistent disadvantage. And so you can see the relationship between needing a system that learns and a different model of accountability, because the flow of information and the flow of decision making needs to be on a different relational basis. It needs to be two-way instead of, it's kind of one directional at the moment. And something I haven't mentioned here, but also the really strong need to take an intergenerational lens into evidence for whether things work or not. The voice of future generations is really kind of absent from the evidence, from our policy thinking and the decisions that get made in general. Okay, so the pathway forward. This is all of our recommendations. This is a visual which kind of pulled them together according to purpose and direction, accountability, and learning and voice. And we kind of tried to phase them. So the blue ones are things that are kind of happening to a certain degree now, but more needs to be done. And then as it goes out to the outer edges, that's kind of the more the really hard stuff that needs to be tackled. So just to summarize, because the set of recommendations is intended as a package, they kind of interlock, reinforce one another, but taken together, they can be summarized as developing clear long-term direction and priorities for well-being across the system, so that we don't have different parts of the system pulling against each other because they've got mandates that contradict. Establishing a social floor that enables social inclusion, putting in place institutions that foster stewardship around learning and to support locally led and whānau-centred wellbeing support, strengthening public accountability for reducing persistent disadvantage, and developing a learning system that adapts, evaluates, listens, and innovates. Some of the dimensions of this are at least partially underway. So the seeds of progress and the seeds of change are already in the system, which is always how system change happens, right? So you build on what's already there and amplify that. And I want to acknowledge all of you who are probably working within the system and trying to affect change yourselves. So, this is again a collective effort to get the change that we want to see. So we recommended that the government give better effect to Te Tiriti by embedding tikanga frameworks like the one I mentioned before, much more integrated into policy making. They're quite peripheral at the moment, despite words that people say. We have recommended cross-party, this is quite aspirational potentially in the political climate that we find ourselves in, but cross-party agreement on long-term wellbeing objectives, right? Wellbeing is a long-term goal. We need to get agreement and we need to commit to that. Otherwise, we're just going to keep going backwards and forwards. And other jurisdictions do that. They set longer-term goals for 20 or 30 years. So can be done, we think. We also recommended that there needs to be much better alignment between the central and local government visions of wellbeing, and that's something that came up in the Future of Local Government review that was also released not quite soon after ours. I'm mindful of time because I want people to ask a question, but I just want to really highlight, so we have called for a first principles review of public accountability. So that's like a full-on, like a independent task force to look at public accountability as one of the really critical system settings that just hasn't had enough attention, and we couldn't really do it justice. And then I want to just highlight the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and Commissioner for Future Generations. It's probably my favourite recommendation. So this comes out of something that's already happening in Wales. This is to really make sure that there is an institution in the system whose job it is to consider the impacts of future generations and to hold the system to account for thinking about those people that aren't yet born and don't have a voice. And so to really encourage that futures thinking and to lift our sights out of the here and now. So we've unpacked in the report some of the functions and roles we think such an institution would have. We've recommended that it be situated in Parliament, a parliamentary institution rather than a ministry, so that it can't be redirected into the problems of today. So that's a really key recommendation. And then we've got a whole lot of recommendations that try and address the ways in which the public management system can learn better and learn alongside local providers. So I'll stop there and hand over to whoever is facilitating the Q&A for the last couple of minutes.
Kia ora, Catherine. No, thank you for sharing all that. I was going to say we will share all the resources, the final report and the qualitative. I think there was a beginning question here. Yep, it's clear as shed. We'll share all those reports, the qualitative, and there is a range of reporting that reports that you have produced through all this, which are really great resources. So yes, and the recommendations are in a document we'll share. There was a question earlier, sorry, and I'm just trying to scroll back through. If anyone wanted to ask anything, Prudence, you've got your hand up, you go for it.
Yeah, fantastic. Hi, Catherine. Thank you very much. I wonder whether through the document there, I really appreciate that you guys have looked at systems and public management. And one of my comments in the chat was that it's fitting that it's the Productivity Commission basically analysing and assessing the productivity of public management systems in Aotearoa. And in that sort of context, I wonder whether you have acknowledged or identified the pay gap between public servants and the people being served by wellbeing measures, the people at the real spiky end of lack of well-being, basically, and whether any of your measures and recommendations address that with any sort of secondment scheme or anything that places public servants in the community for volunteering purposes, or something that insists that for a period of time every year public servants get close to the communities they're publicly managing.
I think we considered, we didn't make that specific recommendation. I think it's a good one. I think we talked in more general terms about the need, the relationship between the people, the decision makers, and people in communities needing to be a closer one, and how do you partner and collaborate in different ways around that. I think we pointed out that the system doesn't enable the kinds of things that you've just mentioned yet. It doesn't, so I think some deeper thinking would be needed, but I think what you've just suggested are really good examples of a system that learns. There's experiential learning needs to be part of that, I think.
And my second question was around I really appreciated you saying that there was a narrow focus on fiscal measurements, and I would say that's a reductive tendency of public management that really underlies all of this, and it actually informs and supports our legislative process too. Forever and amen, I've always insisted in every submission I've written to a select committee to consider the enforcement frameworks and of what this legislation actually means in terms of how it will be enforced and implemented by a public management system. And often the considerations of select committees and our decision makers stops at the act passing. And the how to implement that act afterwards is just like this misnomer that's going to get done somehow by public servants, and that's just not good enough by our leaders. So I wonder whether even the power status levels of Treasury in relation to everybody else when it comes to measuring anything, all of that is it needs really deep systematic change. So where are you at with all of that? Is that all in the pink shade yet to come?
So some of those elements were some of the things we were holding in our minds as we developed those recommendations. The specific example of legislation without sufficient thinking about the long-term implementation, I think, is an example of not thinking about policy making as a systematic approach, right? So it's indicative of the kinds of things that we were calling out in the report, and so long-term thinking, building up capability to do that thinking about how you partner, who you partner with to actually achieve the goals intended by legislative change. all of these things are things that we need to get better at as a country. These are long-term challenges, I think, that have been there for quite a while. So not going to change overnight. But I think, the power dynamics as well was something that we called out in quite a number of ways throughout the report.
Right. Thank you. I know we're at time and people do have to go, but if there was another question, if anyone wanted to ask before we will close. Now, Claire, this is Prudence. I know you've got lots of questions. Now, Claire's just popped up some polls, but is there anyone else who has a question? Before I quickly go to Prudence, because we're running over time. So if you wanted to answer this and the poll that's up there at the moment, Prudence, and then I'll close. And if there are any questions that come through, just pop them into chat and we'll see how we go about maybe getting some of these answers. But Prudence.
So Catherine, I guess you're writing a BIM to incoming ministers. I mean, you're talking about long term, but I mean, we've got a short term to think about with a brand new fresh government and fresh faces to get in front of. So, what is, I mean, are you just focusing on the blue, the little tiny area of blue stuff that you're already doing and pushing forward into that next space, or how are you, what's your incoming advice to the ministers in this fresh government?
So to summarise that question, where to from here, I think is what you're asking. So we did we already briefed the previous government on this, and they did an interim response to the findings. So they honed in on some of the things that they thought that they might progress if they had the chance. Obviously, that's not the circumstance that we find ourselves in. So we will of course work with the new government of the day to share these findings. We did brief the opposition on our way through with this inquiry, as we always do. So we'll just have to work with what we've got. What I would also suggest is that I think there's power in these sorts of coalitions and the advocacy. I mean, we as a public body have one form of influence. You guys have a different kind. So there's opportunity, I think, for advocacy here for people who want to take aspects of this forward. We will probably in the next little while be obliged to move on to our next inquiry. That's the nature of the Productivity Commission, and we're not sure what that topic will be yet, and whether it could be totally different. It could be on tax, it could be on something totally different, and that's how we have to roll as an agency of 25 people. But we will obviously include the key findings into our BIM. Our BIM's focus is on productivity and wellbeing for the long term, which means thinking in that long-term strategic thinking as a country, and what are the features of the public management system of the economy that are needed to support that. So that's the overall message for our BIM.
Kia ora. Thank you for that. Thank you for those final thoughts. Just quickly, is there anyone else who wanted to ask something here? Oh, and Claire's just popped up another poll about topic. Oh no, yes, topic feedback suggestions. If there's anything going forward for next year, we have our November session all lined up with a fellow member organisation who will share more details. Will of course always be in Te Whakaho, which comes out our weekly e-newsletter on a Wednesday. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for this conversation. I think in the times we find ourselves in, we look at a lot of what pre-election posturing and things that were being said, and when we look to the future, and I've loved some of the points from our conversations we've had and those sessions that you run around really how to, and the one I loved and I had noted down was how to be a good ancestor. What kind of society do we want to live in, looking to that long term, which is something we always advocate for within our sector, but to hear that reiterated again. So I don't see any other hands coming up with anything, so I will close and you can all...
Can I just say, Fiona, I'm happy if people want to get in touch with me if they've got other questions, or they want to take an aspect of this forward in their own mahi. So I'm happy for that.
Thank you. There you go, guys. We've got a direct line. I can share your email, or people could come to me and I can forward it on to you. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for you all for being here today. Oh, I see a thumbs up there. Awesome. Thank you, guys. Right, I will close, and so you can all go back into your day. Go well, all you lovely people out there doing the hard work that you do. We love you all here so much from the team. So here we are. Kia tau ngā manaakitanga, ki runga kia tātou. Kua tau, kua ia. Tūturu whakamaua, kia tīna.
Tina.
Homie, huie, tai
Kai
ki.
Kōrero.
Go well, everyone.
Ka kite.
Ka kite.